Alright, we are back for the daily dose of the Shirou glaze. It's the Shirou glaze-a-thon. Oh, brother. From Justin. He says, yo, you should do a vid on if true potential Shirou replaced Ritsuka in FGO. Just more true potential Shirou vids. Ah, ha, ha, ha. By the way, if you haven't already, make sure you guys sign up for the Patreon. You get access to early content and priority on your requests. So, getting off into it, if Shirou replaced Ritsuka during the events of FGO. So I'm gonna start things out under normal circumstances and then we'll work our way into the max potential. So from the very beginning, and I mean going all the way back to Singularity F, the story immediately becomes a lot more intimate than it would have been otherwise because Shirou actually knows Saber. He actually has a history with her, as well with Fuyuki and all of the events that's going on. And we do know that even though Saber is a heroic spirit this time around, and she's not her living self like she was in Fate Stay Night, she does remember things vaguely from time to time. We've seen this on multiple occasions, from her My Room lines to the things that she's mentioned in the story itself. In that very chapter, in terms of dealing with things like Olga, we know that Shirou is a lot more experienced, and also he objectively has a greater latent potential than Ritsuka altogether. So a lot of things that Ritsuka couldn't deal with, Shirou will be able to. For example, Olga being taken away from us. That wouldn't happen. So this would also whirl the story around to go different ways in situations like that. The reason that worked is because Ritsuka, for one, he was new to all of this, but most importantly, he couldn't do anything about it. In the case that it's Shirou, it's not going down. He knows way too much. He has way too many options. It would have to result in something completely different. Another thing that we also know, the story would have to detail the exact events of the Fuyuki Grail War that Marsberry and Solomon won, because that's a direct part of Shirou's background. And for him to exist now, he literally had to be there. So even though he wasn't the one that won, as a part of his backstory, this has to be revealed to us in that way as well. So we get a lot more depth on that. Another thing is the age. As you guys know, the 5th Grail War takes place in 2004, but the story of FGO, at least in JP, starts 11 years later. We know from Stay Night that he was already 17. So by that logic, in FGO, he would already be at least 28 years old. Speaking of potential, he would already be nearing the best of his abilities anyway, because he's so much older now. This would naturally be around the time where he would in fact discover his reality marble. So either he would already have it, or we could experience that alongside him, the awakening, while we're going through the story. That would be a great way to give us some insight on that. It would also make a lot of sense considering all the trauma and the amount of circumstances that he has to overcome. There's also the fact that the story has to deal with Shirou's mental state as a character. Again, one of the main reasons that Ritsuka worked is because he was new, he was fresh to these things, and he didn't have this overall position towards taking out these worlds, that being these singularities or these lost belts, because eventually he got used to it. Not proud of it, I'm sure, but it was something that he overcame. But the issue with that with Shirou is that his entire character centers around saving people. So the very nature of him working for Chaldea goes against who he is as a person, and that alone could easily destroy his mental state even worse while he's going through these missions. Because remember, he has the trauma, Ritsuka doesn't. Ritsuka's trauma is FGO itself. Shirou is coming off the back of trauma and then getting even more trauma. Whole life is just being trauma. So ultimately things could end much worse in that regard, and I'm gonna circle back around to that in a minute. Another thing, the Muramasa deal. There will be no Muramasa because the very nature of Muramasa getting summoned is him hijacking Shirou's body. He can't hijack the body if he's already there. We've never seen that. It's never been a case of some type of impromptu hijacking. Every time we see somebody get hijacked, they exist, they were doing their own thing, but it's usually off screen. So instead Outside of Muramasa existing, those scenarios would just lean into more extended Shirou arcs. So for things like Shimosa, Lost Belt 6, Olympus, all of those things would be something that Shirou would just have to deal with straightforward. In the Alien Guide, just like they had to find a new body instead of Olga, they also would have to find another prospect that replaces Shirou. So yeah, no Muramasa. I don't think people really cared about Muramasa anyway. They just cared about Shirou, and he just so happens to be in Shirou's body, but the story could easily work without him. Now, whether Shirou keeps things like his blade is completely subject to how the story goes down. It would more so be down to would that still link to his reality marble, or we could just have something that replaces it. Which reality marble would he have? Would he have his OG one, the one from Muramasa, or one completely different because of the events that he went through in FGO? Again, a lot of his reality marbles are centered around the things that he goes through specifically as a character. That's why they're all different. So even this Shirou has potential to make a completely different reality marble by the time that we see it. Or he could just have both. This could potentially open the lane for more character arcs with some of the OG characters from the series. So instead of them being pseudo servants, they could also be brought into the story directly, the same way that Shirou is. Just like him, they also will be in a place in their life where they're a lot older, so we can expect all types of new things from them if it decides to go that route. Personally, I do still want to see Shirou interact with these new pseudo variants, these Ren faces, these Sakura faces, him going against Kiara especially. Would they keep Emiya Alter or would they bar him? Because just because Shirou exists doesn't mean that Emiya Alter couldn't. As a matter of fact, that whole chapter would be a Shirou meetup. You got the real Shirou, Emiya, and Emiya Alter. The three of them walk into a bar. Every time that he runs into Rasputin, it's gonna be a movie because him and Kirei are just natural enemies anyway. And this time, since it's actually Shirou, it's gonna make the dialogue a lot more interesting. I just wish it was actually Kirei too, but can't have everything. You have to account for his interactions with MASH and how well they will bond, because we know a big part of MASH being really fond of Ritsuka is her looking up to him to a point where she wants to protect him no matter what. But she wouldn't necessarily have to protect Shirou as much. So would that make her feel beside herself? Would that stun her growth? Would that make her feel different towards Shirou in particular? Maybe she wouldn't be as fond for that very reason. We do know that the base pairing of Shirou and Artoria is literally sword and sheath, but this pairing would be like sheath and sheath. So I guess they would be like lesbos. I don't know, man. I just know things are gonna get weird in several ways. And again, addressing the Beast scenario, how would he interact with them? Would Shirou even disagree with Goetia in the first place? Remember, Goetia falls more so in the line of a Kirisugu mentality, where he's the one biting the bullet for the greater good. Now, I do think that Shirou by the end of the first part of FGO will still be holding it together, so it's highly likely that he will still disagree. But if you were to ask that same question by the end of part 2, I couldn't tell you what he'd do. And this works as the perfect segue into his max potential portion. And this is piggybacking off of my max potential Shirou video that I did years ago, where I pretty much posed the idea of everything going right in Shirou's life. Completely over the top fanfic style, but it was just for fun. And in that video, I posed that he would be immortal. He would know everything from Kiritsugu, from Emiya Alter, as well as having his blade, pretty much unlimited energy, a bunch of things. Now this time around, with Shirou having so much at his disposal, the story immediately loses a lot of the gravitas that it had before, because that's what it's based around. But the main deal here is that he wouldn't necessarily need that much help, if he needs help at all, because he's that powerful. And if he does get help from all these servants that we had before, it will be a complete one-sided wipe. It wouldn't even be a story. Going back to the Beast conversations, how would he deal with them? Because with Shirou being so powerful, it's very likely that the story itself might have to buff the enemies to match his power, which could induce even more trauma. That was bad enough the first time around in his normal state, but now that Shirou is this strong, if he loses it, then he becomes a threat to humanity. He becomes a potential beast, because who's gonna stop him? He's the lead character. And not only that, but we have supporting evidence of him making these types of turns in the story. It only takes so many heart-wrenching situations for Shirou to turn Mind of Steel, for him to turn Emiya Alter. So in that vein, we would be royally screwed, because, well, he was our main character. It would have to be a situation where we would really get the cryptors now, because we need them. So if he turns before the point where we take them all out, then we can see the story from their perspective, and also look at FGO, how it was supposed to be viewed. That's also a thing. Ritsuka took their spot. He wasn't supposed to be the lead character either. If you want to get technical about it, it was supposed to be the A-team. If Shirou does turn at a point that we've already taken out the cryptors, they could invite a second set of cryptors, or we just run into a different team altogether, because somebody has to deal with this situation. You can't just let Shirou run wild and ruin the world. And I mean that on a fundamental level. Before the counterforce even gets involved, this has to be addressed. But that's only if he turns. And if he doesn't, then like I said, everything will just fall into his lap, because with all the things that I mentioned in that video, nobody could stand against him unless they are equally as powerful. And with all the servants, all the support, he would essentially have everything that Ritsuka had, mystic codes and all. He would be straight. That's another part that would make things easier for Shirou, even in his normal state, is that he's way more durable than Ritsuka, and Ritsuka still managed to survive. So Shirou would also have that same health, that same durability, on top of still having Avalon inside of him, still having his body being made of swords, and any other conceptual defense that he's learned by that point in time. Ultimately, it would be ridiculous.